Not never kill, but always save. First off, we will be talking about the anime, not the manga, and this video will assume that you have watched it. A spoiler warning is barely worth it, honestly, because if you never watched the show, this video will be nearly incomprehensible to you. Trigun's message is often interpreted as a critique of the philosophy of Vash the Stampede, and at first glance it's easy to see why. Vash does everything in his considerable power to never allow anybody, no matter how terrible, to die. And then, in the moment of terrible crisis, when innocent people are about to be shot dead for no reason at all by a sociopath, Vash finally pulls the trigger. Forced to kill in order to save lives is definitive proof that Vash was wrong to be so naive as to think there was nobody who ever needed killing. I've even seen some analyses claim that Wolfwood was proven right in the end. And yes, it is easy to see why somebody would think this, but it is also incorrect. Trigun is not and never was a critique of Vash's philosophy. In fact, it is an explicit defense and ultimately affirmation of Vash's philosophy. What Trigun is a critique of the character of Vash, and how his guilt causes him to warp that philosophy into something far more selfish. Before we get ahead of ourselves, let's go back to that first point. What is Vash's original philosophy? Going off of the teachings of his mentor and the first human who ever truly loved him, Rem, we can summarize it as save everyone. Vash believes it is a moral imperative not only not to take a life, but to do everything in your power to prevent the taking of a life whenever you have the opportunity to do so. Vash puts his money where his mouth is on this point, literally shredding his body to pieces if necessary to accomplish his goal. Ultimately, Vash believes that the best way to make the world a better place is to protect people. Even on this point, it is impossible for Vash to be entirely consistent, and despite some claims to the contrary, Vash is not actually a pacifist. Pacifists refuse to fight, but Vash is perfectly willing to deal damage and cause pain if the situation calls for it. Vash does not believe in do no harm, but rather something closer to do as little harm as possible. The only unacceptable behavior is killing, and I'll avoid calling it murder since that implies moral connotations which are exactly the things at stake here. This is the line that Vash claims is never ever permissible to cross. Vash manages to follow this philosophy with success until the arrival of Legato. Legato is the ultimate nihilist. He believes in no higher purpose, no greater meaning for mankind, and so sees people's lives as expendable. He makes it his life's mission to make Vash break his no-kill rule, and with Meryl and Millie held up at gunpoint, he manages it. Legato accomplishes his goal, and Vash kills him in order to save more lives. This is always the point where people get tripped up, and it's actually rather cleverly written, since this is also the spot that Vash is tripped up. The problem, however, is that too few viewers realize the sleight of hand going on here, even though Vash eventually catches it. At this point in the show, Vash has stopped following his stated philosophy of save everyone. He has moved on, probably without even noticing it, to a philosophy of never kill anyone. At this point of the story, Vash has made this shift for personal reasons, which we'll discuss later, but the important thing to note is that there is a world of difference between these two phrases. The wording of the first phrase refuses to make allowances for circumstance and condemns people equally who are not in the same moral sphere, something that Wolfwood correctly objects to. The second phrase is actually entirely different. When your life goal is not never kill, but rather always save, then you are going to be forced at times to make a judgment call about who needs saving. This is just how life works, since human beings are not omnipotent creatures. Normal humans don't have the ability to come up with third options the way Vash does, but even Vash is ultimately not all powerful and is forced to make a choice when Legato forces his hand. That Legato force Vash's hand is also significant. Always save has an element of choice to it that never kill does not. If somebody refuses to be saved, even if you offer them that opportunity, you are no longer morally at fault if they get hurt. However, if your philosophy is to never kill, then if you ever need to pull that trigger, no matter how necessary it is, you have just condemned yourself for doing it, which is why Vash is so traumatized by this. Remember, we are looking at this from the perspective of a Catholic philosophy, since this is the philosophy of the author of the original manga, and conversely, also the philosophy of the anime based on it. To explain this a bit more clearly, the always save philosophy would work in exactly the way we see it in the show. Give Legato every chance humanly possible to back out, give him the opportunity to walk away, do everything in your power to protect people, and then only if he is still going to fire on innocents do you make the call to pull your own trigger. The never kill philosophy simply fizzles out here. Either innocent people are dying, or you failed utterly. You've broken the unbreakable rule. Vash has too refined of a conscience to let his philosophy get in the way of the lives of Meryl and Millie, so he, as he sees it at the time, sacrifices his own moral character for them. But what he is actually sacrificing is the faulty view that he had been operating under all along. Thus we see the problem. Vash has turned a positive command to do into a negative command, never to do. But that was never what Rem actually said, never the lesson she actually tried to impart. Consider early in the story one of the first interactions between Rem, Vash, and Knives. Knives kills a spider who was going to kill a butterfly, upsetting Vash, but Knives responds that one or the other was going to die either way. If the spider couldn't eat the butterfly, then the spider would starve. This is what prompts Rem to respond that such a decision should never be made lightly, that one should always strive for everyone to survive whenever possible. This is the true philosophy of Rem that Vash originally lives by. So, what's with Vash's reaction after Legato's death at his hands? Why does he label himself a sinner? Why does he have an existential crisis? Let's go back to the beginning and examine our thesis. To understand this, we need to understand that Trigun was never a critique of Vash's original philosophy, it was a critique of Vash, the person. The crux of all of this is the July incident. This event is what caused Vash's motives to change from pure altruism to a form of extreme guilt. After Knives forces Vash to destroy the town of July, everything changes for Vash. In his own eyes, he is no longer a person but a weapon, an agent capable of terrible destruction. His life becomes consumed with proving to himself that this is not who he is, that he isn't a person who kills. He needs to make up for the death that he caused in the aftermath of the explosion, and he needs to do this by never killing anyone ever again. This is why he is so distraught after the death of Legato, not because he wasn't able to save everyone in that one instance, tragic though that may be, but because by killing Legato, he confirmed in his mind his identity as a bringer of death. This is much more selfish, and this is what the show is actually criticizing. Not the philosophy that we should always try to save everyone, no matter what sacrifices have to be made, but self pity that paralyzes action through a sense of guilt separate from a true desire to do the right thing. So, where does Wolfwood fit into this puzzle? Wolfwood's arc should be our first clue that the narrative ultimately isn't supporting his perspective. The show does a great job of presenting his point of view fairly. It is Wolfwood who points out the apparent unfairness of Vash trying to impose his own nearly impossible standards on normal human beings, something that Wolfwood sees as insulting at worst and naive at best. But it is in his last moments, bleeding out on his knees in a church in one of the greatest death scenes of all time, that Wolfwood repents of his own philosophy. The final shot that we get of Wolfwood is him crutching a cross, sunlight streaming down. And later we hear him at a critical moment of the finale where he saves Vash's life. Unlike Vash, Wolfwood does not have the superhuman reflexes that would allow him to dodge a bullet to the back, which makes him in some ways even more heroic than Vash ever could be. Wolfwood actually dies as a result of following Vash's philosophy, yet still he acknowledges that he was wrong. He accepts the cost, and despite wanting to survive, he never regrets his choice to save Chapel. Wolfwood originally had the moral order of events exactly backwards. He went into every situation with the premise that in order to save good people, it was necessary for bad people to die. His original goal was even to assassinate Vash and Knives. But after sparing Chapel and getting shot in the back for his trouble, he realizes that he was wrong to never even try to save everybody. Wrong to go into things with the perspective that killing people was inevitably going to be necessary. And his repentance of this philosophy saves Wolfwood. It is more than fitting that our final shot of Wolfwood is of him in that church. Wolfwood is saved because he repents of his old philosophy and embraces Vash's. He was not and never was a bad man, but he was misled. Vash it was right, and when Wolfwood recognizes that, he is able to die redeemed. There are two more clues that the anime is not a rejection of Vash's philosophy, but of Vash's twisted, guilt-ridden application of it, and they come from the final two episodes of the show. After shooting Legato, Vash is a broken man. He is, as he says, a sinner. Notice how this is phrased. Vash saves Marilyn Millie's life, yet the focus is ultimately on how it affects him. His thinking is still warped and selfish due to his guilt. What breaks him out of his haze is seeing Meryl rescue him as he is being dragged out of town. Meryl diffuses the situation by quoting his own words almost exactly, mirroring his and Rem's philosophy. Vash comes to the realization that his actions had stopped being about the philosophy itself, but instead had turned into a way for him to handle his own guilt. That his motivation had stopped being entirely altruistic, but instead was about his personal hangups. It is this realization that the problem was not the philosophy, but him, that ultimately lets him move forward, this time with the proper resolve to face Knives without being burdened by his guilt, but instead driven by a true desire to save everybody. And now we get to the final piece of this puzzle, the ultimate thesis statement of the entire show. In the finale, Vash wins a totally epic duel with Knives. He has him at his mercy, the psychopathic serial killer, this man who was ready and willing to cause the extinction of humanity, and who without Vash probably would have achieved his goal. At this point, Wolfwood, before his repentance, would have pulled the trigger without a second thought, and if Vash truly believed that his philosophy was wrong, he would do the same. And yet he doesn't. The very last shot of the show is Vash walking away with the bandaged Knives in his arms. This scene, this moment, is what the show was trying to tell us. It isn't the pragmatism of Wolfwood that wins the day. It is the altruism and the mercy of Vash. Save everyone, Trigun tells us. There is no distinction made between the good and bad people. We are to try and save everyone. We are to love even our enemies. And whether you like it or not, and many don't like it, this is the message of Trigun. I hope you enjoyed this analysis of one of my all-time favorite anime. My name is Anthony Marchetta. I am the editor-in-chief and co-author of the collaborative novels God Robot and Tales of the Once and Future King, both of which can be found on Amazon. I also publish a column on the Castalia House website called Superversive Tuesday and co-host the Superversive livestream with Benjamin Wheeler, author of Shyke of Mars and Tears of Elfland. Thank you for watching, and remember to tune into the live stream at 7 p.m. on Sunday.